My name is Amelia Hartman. I am 64. I make pottery in a small studio that leans into the stone edge of Lake Como. I am an American widow who learned to live with quiet. Clay under my nails, steam rising from a chipped jasmine teacup on winter mornings. I have one daughter, Clara. I have a house that breathes with the water. I have a heart that never learned to complain out loud. I wasn't invited to my daughter's wedding I paid for in Italy. She texted me, "Stay home. It's a party for our friends, LOL." So I just replied, "Have a wonderful day." The next morning, her new husband was begging me to call back. The message landed while the lake was the color of pewter, before the swan stirred, before the first ferry cut a white thread across the water. The phone pulsed in my palm, a cold square of light against the kitchen's old oak. I stood by the window in my wool socks, the kettle ticking as it lost heat, jasmine mist curling from the lip of my teacup where a small chip had lived for years. The chip is a memory, a 6-year-old hand, a wobble, tea sloshing, both of us laughing at the tiny wound in the porcelain. I kept it. I keep most things that hurt and matter. The text did not say, "Mother." It said, "Stay home." It did not mention that the venue's deposit carried my name, that the flowers were chosen with my card, that the suit fitting had happened on my day off. It said, "Party for our friends." It giggled with 3 letters that mean nothing when someone has taught herself to be polite while breaking you. I breathed, lifted the phone, typed 4 words that were not tears and not a fight. "Have a wonderful day." I pressed send, set the phone face down, watched the steam thin to nothing. Silence has a sound when you have used up all your good reasons. It is the weight of a plate, set down without a fork, the hiccup of a clock skipping a beat, the soft grind of clay beneath your thumb. I looked at my hands. They have lines that remember rent, due dates, and night shifts, and the winter I sold my pearls to keep the heat on. I told them, "Not today. Not today will we beg for our place at our own table." The phone lit. Once, twice, again. An unfamiliar number at first, then the name that would soon learn mine. Ethan. The new husband with a quick smile and a watch that cost more than my kiln. Ethan called, left a message that was only my name drawn out like a plea. Then he called again, 5 times, 10. The screen a metronome for someone else's panic. I let it ring. I listened to the lake breathe. Somewhere across the water, a bell counted the hour as if nothing had happened. I thought about the way joy is supposed to arrive, in a dress hem, in a choir, in a cake that will not feed the person who baked every birthday before it. I thought about a promise I once made to myself, that I would not make noise when silence could carry my meaning farther. I wondered what, in one fast night, could turn a man into a beggar of phone calls, numbers due, contracts, falling through, a mother-sized absence at a table built on her savings. I did not need to know yet. I needed to feel my feet on the tile, to own the stillness I had paid for with years. The cup warmed my lip where the porcelain is imperfect, a tender sting that felt like truth. The truth is simple. Love without respect is a loan without terms. I set the cup down, the ring of ceramic against wood, a small bell of decision. The kettle sighed, the lake answered, the gulls wrote slashes in the sky. I picked up the phone and turned off the sound. Each call folded itself into the quiet like a gull into fog. People think strength is a shout, a slammed door, a speech with witnesses. I learned mine at a bank window lit by fluorescent mercy, at a workbench where a pot collapses and you wedge the clay again, at a graveside where no one tells you who you are now. I stood in my kitchen and let the morning be what it was, a beginning that felt like an ending that felt like a key finally turning. If you are listening and something inside you recognizes the taste of that quiet, stay with me. This is not a story about revenge with fire. It is a story about justice with breath. If you have ever stood at a window and held your phone like a hot coal, If you have ever chosen not to call back, tell me where you drew your line. Your words help other hands stop shaking. Your presence here keeps this room warm. The phone flashed again. Ethan's name, the lake, the bell, my breath. I lifted the cup. The chip found my lip. I let it. Somewhere in Florence, a planner refreshed a screen. Somewhere in Milan, a florist checked a balance. Somewhere in this house, a woman who has always paid in full decided to invest in silence. When I finally looked at the call log, there were more missed calls than years of my daughter's life. I pressed the power button. The world narrowed to water and steam and a heartbeat I could hear. Then I rinsed the cup, set it carefully on the rack, and walked toward the studio where the clay waits for my hands. The morning air off Lake Como carried the kind of chill that feels clean, almost sharp. It curled into my sleeves as I stepped out onto the stone porch. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter before I opened the door. Its black screen turned away from me, like a face I no longer needed to read. In my right hand, the old brass watering can felt cool, the handle worn smooth from decades of mornings just like this. The scent of damp earth rose before the first drop hit the soil. The geraniums, my mother always called them by their old name, pelargoniums, sat in clay pots along the porch rail. Their red blooms were deep, almost wine dark, and each petal held the faint silver of dew. I tilted the can, watching the thin stream soak the roots, the leaves trembling slightly with the weight. The lake stretched beyond, gray-blue under a gauze of early fog, the kind that makes the far shore look like a painted dream. Somewhere, across the water, a bell chimed the hour, soft and round. For 30 years, I have answered every call. When Clara was in college and short on rent, I answered. When she took a job in New York and hated her first apartment, I answered. When she broke her wrist skiing and needed help with the simplest tasks, I answered. Even when she called just to cry about nothing she could name, I answered. It became my reflex, like breathing, like turning my head toward the sound of my own name. But today, I did not. 30 years I've trained myself to respond the moment she calls, I thought, pressing my palm gently against a cool leaf. And today I am training myself to let it ring. The sound of water leaving the spout reminded me of a different morning, one that had nothing to do with weddings or bank accounts. Clara was 7. I was working the early shift at the bakery, the one that started before sunrise, when the air outside smelled like sugar and yeast. My apron was floured to the elbows when the phone rang behind the counter. It was the school nurse, her voice quick and careful. Clara had fallen on the playground. She had scraped her knees and hit her head. She was scared, crying for me. I remember the way the dough felt in my hands when I dropped it back into the bowl, the way the flour hung in the air like pale smoke as I untied my apron. I left the register open, the cash drawer visible, my keys in the lock, because there was no world in which I was going to finish my shift before going to her. My boss shouted something as I grabbed my coat. I don't even remember what. I remember running. The bakery was 4 blocks from the school, but that morning it felt like miles. My lungs burned, my calves screamed. And then there she was, sitting on a bench in the nurse's office, a Band-Aid half peeling from her knee, a tissue in one hand. She saw me and her face crumpled with relief. She said, "Mom, you came so fast." I knelt down, checked her head for swelling, brushed dirt from her shins. I remember thinking, this is what it means to be needed. Not just wanted, needed. That kind of pull makes you drop everything, even the things you cannot afford to drop. The geraniums drank slowly as that memory settled next to me. I moved to the next pot and the next, tipping the can just enough to darken the soil. Now, all these years later, the same girl who once cried for me to come so fast tells me to stay home, and not just tells me, laughs as she does it. The breeze lifted a strand of hair across my cheek. Somewhere down the lane, the postman's cart rattled over the cobblestones. I straightened, taking in the stillness. This porch, this lake, these flowers, they have seen every version of me. The girl who arrived here, in love. The young mother who measured days by school bells. The widow who learned to fix her own locks and carry her own groceries. And now, the woman who can choose not to answer. I set the watering can down and leaned on, the railing looking at the line where the fog met the mountains. There was a time I would have gone back inside, picked up the phone, tried to smooth things over before they turned sharp. That time has passed. The calls would keep coming, but so would the quiet if I let it. I thought about the chipped teacup on the counter, cooling. How even broken things can still hold warmth if you pour it in yourself. The lake gave a small sigh against the shore. I stayed there another minute, my hands resting on the worn wood, the scent of damp leaves around me. I told myself, you can love someone and still not let them pull you into the deep. You can step back. You can breathe. And for the first time in years, I did. The night before the calls began, I walked down the narrow cobblestone street toward the bank. The air carried the faint sweetness of chestnuts roasting from a stand by the square. The street lamps spilled their soft gold over stone, leaving pockets of darkness between each pool of light. My shoes tapped against the uneven stones, steady, deliberate. I had already made my decision hours earlier, but the walk felt like a kind of rehearsal. The glass doors slid open with a hush, letting out the smell of polished wood and warm paper. Most of the counters were closed for the day. Only one window remained lit. Behind it stood Luca, a teller I had known for nearly 15 years. He had watched me set up Clara's first savings account. He had handed me tissues the day I came in after my husband's funeral to change the name on our mortgage. He looked up and smiled, the kind of small, respectful smile you give someone you've known long enough to skip formalities. "Buonasera, Signora Hartman," he said. "What can I do for you tonight?" I stepped forward, my bag resting lightly in the crook of my elbow. "I need to cancel a transfer," I told him. My voice was calm, perhaps calmer than I expected it to be. He tapped at his keyboard. "Which one?" "The wire scheduled for the wedding venue in Florence." I paused, letting the words find their place in the quiet room. 45,000 euros. He stilled for a moment, his fingers resting on the keys. "Is everything all right?" "The circumstances have changed," I said. It was the truth. No more, no less. He nodded, typed again, then swiveled his screen slightly as if to confirm we were speaking about the same amount. "If you are sure, I can cancel it now. There will be no penalty since it has not been processed." I gave him a small smile. "I am sure." The printer hummed. The form slid into place in front of me. The pen was cool between my fingers. I looked down at the paper, the black letters spelling out my name, the account numbers, the transfer details. My hand hovered for a moment above the signature line. In that stillness, the world seemed to slow. I could hear the faint tick of the wall clock, the shuffle of a security guard's shoes somewhere in the lobby, the quiet sigh of the air vent above my head. My fingers curled around the pen, and the point touched the paper. I signed my name in one smooth stroke. The ink glided, leaving behind a line that was mine and mine alone. Each letter felt like a small release, a loosening in my chest. When I set the pen down, I exhaled, long and low. The weight I had carried from my kitchen to this desk shifted, lightened. Yet underneath the lightness, there was a thin tremor, like the faint shake in your legs after standing too long. Not regret, not doubt. Just the body recognizing that a chapter had been turned with a single motion. Luca took the paper, checked it, then looked up at me again. "All done. The transfer's canceled." I nodded, slipping the strap of my bag back over my shoulder. "Thank you, Luca." He hesitated. "Will you be all right?" I met his eyes. "I will." The words surprised me with how true they sounded. Stepping back into the night, the air felt cooler, sharper. The lights from the bank glowed behind me for a moment before the doors closed. I walked toward home with the same steady pace, but my hands were free now, my bag lighter. The square was quiet. The chestnut stand had closed. I passed the fountain, the water catching the lamplight, and felt the small pulse of satisfaction in my throat. At the corner, I stopped under a street lamp, pulling my coat tighter. I looked up. The stars had begun to break through the haze, scattered and unbothered by anything that happened on the ground. The sound of the lake reached me faintly from a block away, its rhythm the same as it had been every night for centuries. By the time I reached my door, the run of lights across the opposite shore was a blurred string of gold. Inside, the house smelled faintly of jasmine tea and cool stone. I set my bag on the chair, my keys in the dish. My phone sat on the counter where I had left it earlier, silent for now. I didn't reach for it. I touched the edge of the chipped teacup, still on the drying rack. My fingers fit into the small curve of the flaw, and I let them rest there. The cup was imperfect, but it could still hold what I poured into it. Tonight, that was enough. After the bank, I did not turn on the television. I let the quiet hold. The house carried the cool of evening stone. The lake pressed its slow breath against the windows. I walked to the bedroom and knelt beside the old wardrobe where I keep what I cannot give away. Behind folded blankets sat a wooden box the size of a loaf of bread, cedar darkened by years, corners rubbed smooth by my hands. I slid it forward, the lid lifted with a familiar creak that sounded almost like my name. My knees pressed the rug. Dust rose. My breath steadied. Inside, the lining was faded blue velvet. A few photographs lay bound with kitchen string. A playbill from a Milan recital rested on top. Beneath it, a narrow envelope hid like a decision. I lifted the envelope. The paper was thick and cool. The flap unsealed. I drew out a rectangle of pale gold and knew its weight before I read it. A concert ticket. New York. A seat I had promised myself when promising myself anything still felt possible. The date belonged to another winter, the perforation clean. The row and seat were a promise that never reached me. I had saved for months, coins stacked in a teacup on the kitchen shelf, tips folded into a paperback I never finished. I could see myself in a balcony at Carnegie Hall, hands clasped, the bow rising like a wing in light. Then Clara called. She was already in New York. A job that glittered in interviews had turned gray by the second week. Her voice shook over a poor connection. The landlord wanted first and last month of rent. The mover demanded another payment. The roommate backed out. She was 22. Breathing fast, she said emergency. I moved. The next morning, I walked past the bank to a jeweler 2 streets over, a narrow shop with a single lamp that made each surface look honest. I took off my wedding ring, the gold still warm from my skin, the stone small but sincere. My husband chose it in Chicago one spring afternoon. He laughed because it fit without resizing. He said our lives had been measured. The jeweler weighed the ring like a man counting years. He named a fair figure lower than love and higher than pride. I nodded. He wrote the receipt. I left with money. I paid Clara's deposit that day. I bought her a transit pass. I filled her refrigerator with food a young body can run on. I did not mention the concert. I did not mention the ring. She hugged me at the curb outside her building. Taxis hissed in rain. A pigeon strutted between our shoes like a small blessing. She said, "You always make it work, Mom. Thank you." I kissed her hairline and told her to text when she was inside. I rode the subway to Queens with empty hands and a steady heart. The car rattled, windows blurred. Years multiplied while I was not watching. The envelope kept its pale secret. The box kept watch. Some winters I would take the ticket out and hold it under a lamp, letting the paper reflect a soft square of light. I would imagine the overture and the applause that falls like rain. I could see the conductor lift his hand. I could feel my chest answer. Then I would return the ticket to its envelope and close the lid, not in anger, in postponement that felt almost tender. Life made lists. I crossed off other things. The ticket waited patiently. Tonight was different. I turned the cardstock and felt its faint rasp against my fingertips. The room smelled of cedar and jasmine. Outside, water tapped the shore with a patient hand. There are sacrifices no one ever remembers. Some are meant to stay invisible so someone else can stand in a brighter place. I thought of Clara's message, of laughter inside the order to stay home, of how a sentence can rename a life. The truth is not dramatic. I sold a ring. I paid bills. I missed a concert. I carried the cost quietly. I asked only for courtesy. I set the ticket on the velvet and studied the photographs. A young man with his collar crooked grinned like he was trying on the future. A little girl with scraped knees held a plastic crown as if it were gold. I felt tenderness and fatigue and the steady strength that comes when a person stops explaining worth. I slid the ticket back into its envelope, returned it to its place. The lid fell with a domestic sigh. Wood met wood like a period. I pushed the blankets forward until the cedar disappeared, burying a small, dear thing, honoring it. The next morning, as the fog was still folding itself back from the lake, I heard the low creak of the side gate. Only one person in this village opens it that way, slow enough not to startle the birds nesting in the hedge. Henry Wallace, my neighbor of 12 years, stepped into view carrying a small tray with 2 cups and a dented teapot. His wool cap sat low over his ears. His coat had flecks of sawdust on the shoulders. "I saw your fence leaning again," he said, his voice warm but quiet, as if we were in a library. "Figured I'd fix it before the wind makes it worse." I met him at the porch steps, taking the tray from his hands. The steam from the tea curled into the air. It smelled of bergamot and something faintly sweet. Henry always brewed it strong, the way the English seem to believe can cure most ills. He set his toolbox down without asking where the problem was. He already knew. He had mended that same section twice in the last 5 years. We sat for a moment on the porch, each with our cup. The geraniums at my elbow were still damp from yesterday's watering. I told him, in the simplest words I could manage, about Clara's message. I did not show him the text. I did not need to. His eyes held mine for just long enough to say, without words, that he understood. Not the polite understanding people offer when they cannot imagine your pain, but the kind that comes from having walked through a similar door and finding it locked behind you. He took a slow sip of his tea before speaking. "My son stopped speaking to me 4 years ago," he said. "It was after Marlene, his stepmother, passed. There was the matter of the house in Devon. I thought he would want it, but he said the memories were too heavy. I offered to sell and split the money. He accused me of trying to cheat him, as if I hadn't raised him alone for a decade before she came along." I listened, the steam from my cup softening the edges of his words. "He sent me one letter after that," Henry went on, "told me he didn't want me at his wedding. Said it would be awkward for his wife's family. That was the word. Awkward. Haven't heard his voice since." He didn't look away as he spoke, but there was a stillness in his face, the kind people wear when the hurt has moved from sharp to permanent. I thought of the bank, the wooden box, the ticket, of how loss has many dialects but the same vocabulary. "I'm sorry, Henry," I said. He shrugged one shoulder, the way men do when they want to say they've made peace with something they never asked for. "You keep living," he said. "You keep mending what can be mended. Fences, teapots, your own days." He stood then, taking up his hammer. I watched him move toward the fence, the boards dark with age. The sound of the nails tapping into place was rhythmic, almost like the metronome in the pottery studio when I throw clay. Each strike seemed to stitch something closed. While he worked, I poured the rest of the tea into our cups. When he returned, wiping his hands on a rag, he accepted his with a small nod. "She doesn't know what she's giving up, Amelia," he said. "Neither did my boy. They think time waits, but it doesn't. One day they turn around and the bridge is gone." I thought about that, how a bridge can disappear without a sound, leaving only air where your steps used to land. "Maybe it's not my job to build it again," I said. He looked at me over the rim of his cup. It's not. We finished the tea in companionable silence, the kind that feels like shelter. Henry gathered his tools, checked the fence one last time, then headed back through the gate. I stood on the porch until the latch clicked behind him, the steam from the empty cup slipping into the cool morning air. That afternoon, with the fence mended and the teacups washed, I carried my laptop to the kitchen table. The light through the window had softened to that late-day gold that makes everything look briefly forgiving. I was wiping a smudge from the screen when the call came in. Isabel's name, all capitals, stretching across the display. I hadn't seen her in person for nearly a decade. We kept up in messages and occasional calls, but she was still in Boston, still running the little gallery she had built from scratch. I clicked accept, and her face appeared, framed by shelves crowded with clay and glass. Her hair was silver now, pulled into a knot at the nape of her neck, but her eyes were the same sharp blue they had been when we were 20. "Amy," she said, leaning in, "tell me you're sitting down." "I am," I said, forcing a smile. She studied my face for a beat too long. "You look like you've been swallowing stones." I laughed softly because it was easier than explaining. "Clara's wedding plans have changed." "Changed how?" I told her. "Not every detail, just enough to let the truth show without dressing it up." Her lips pressed into a line, the way they used to when a professor said something foolish. Then she asked it, the question that slid under my ribs before I could brace myself. "When are you going to stop rescuing people who don't want to be rescued?" I sat back, the words lodging in my chest. Isabel never wasted sentences. She built them like the pots we used to throw together, steady and intentional. Her question pulled me into a memory I hadn't touched in years. We were 25, both newly married, both convinced we could balance art and life. We had a plan to open a pottery studio together in a converted mill outside Boston. High windows, white walls, wheels lined up like promises. We spent months sketching layouts, pricing kilns, dreaming of the smell of clay in the mornings. Then I found out I was pregnant with Clara. The timing didn't just shift, it shattered. My husband was traveling for work. The rent was going up. The car needed repairs. I told Isabel I couldn't take the risk. She tried to argue, to offer me more time, to adjust the plan, but I shook my head. I sold my share of the equipment we had bought and put the money toward a crib, diapers, and a year's worth of baby clothes. Isabel opened the studio alone. She named it Half Moon Pottery, a nod to the nights we used to stay late at the wheel, shaping clay under a single hanging bulb. I told myself I'd join her later, when things settled, but later kept moving farther away. The years filled with school runs, hospital visits, double shifts, and the kind of emergencies you can't schedule. By the time I thought I might have room for art again, the studio was a thriving gallery with Isabel's name on the door, and no space for another partner. She never resented me, but I knew the place had become hers entirely. Now, watching her through the grainy glow of the screen, I felt that old ache. Not regret exactly, more like the weight of a life lived on detours. Her question had stripped away the layer of excuses I still carried, exposing the raw truth beneath. I had made a habit of giving up my place so someone else could stand more comfortably. I swallowed. "I don't know," I said. "Maybe now." She nodded, her eyes softening. "It's not selfish to keep something for yourself, Amy. It's survival. You taught me that once, remember? Back when we were the ones making the rules." I let the words settle. The kitchen was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I realized I was gripping the edge of the table, as if bracing for another blow. Isabel leaned closer to the camera. "Promise me you'll think about what you want, not what you owe, Not what you can give, what you want. I promised. The word felt strange on my tongue, as if it belonged to a language I hadn't spoken in years. We talked a little longer about her upcoming exhibit, about the weather in Boston, about nothing at all. But even after we said goodbye and her face disappeared from the screen, her question stayed, echoing in the quiet. When are you going to stop rescuing people who don't want to be rescued? I sat there until the light shifted again, knowing I could no longer pretend I hadn't heard it. The next day, I was in the studio early, the clay cool and damp beneath my palms. The wheel hummed under my foot, a steady rhythm that usually quieted my mind. I was shaping the curve of a small vase when I heard the door open. Marco stepped inside, his cheeks flushed from the cold. He carried something folded in his hands, his fingers working the edges as if he wasn't quite sure how to give it to me. Marco is 20, tall and wiry, with dark hair that always falls into his eyes when he works at the wheel. He came to me 2 years ago, asking if I would teach him. His Italian is fast, his English is careful. We speak in a mix of both, our conversation stitched together with gestures and the universal language of wet clay. He stood just inside the door, shifting his weight. "Signora Amelia," he said, his voice shy in a way I didn't often hear from him. "I made you something." I wiped my hands on a towel coming around the table. He unfolded the bundle to reveal a pair of knitted gloves, soft gray wool with a simple cable pattern running down the back of each hand. They were not store perfect. One cuff was looser than the other, and a single stitch near the thumb was pulled a little tight. But they were warm, and they were made for my hands. "They're beautiful," I said, taking them from him. The wool was soft, the kind that would hold heat even on the coldest mornings. "I saw your hands last week," he said, looking at the floor. "You were trimming a pot and they looked cold. My aunt taught me to knit when I was little. So I made these." There was no other reason. No holiday, no favor owed, no hidden request waiting to follow the gift. Just an observation and the desire to ease what he saw. I pulled the gloves on. They fit well, hugging my fingers without tightening. "Grazie, Marco," I said. "They're perfect." He smiled, quick and small, like a child who has just passed a secret test. Then he moved toward the wheel he usually used, setting down his bag. As I went back to my vase, I felt the warmth of the wool against my skin, the way it had been measured for me and no one else. It struck me then how rare it is to be noticed without being needed. Clara had noticed my hands 1,000 times, pouring tea, writing checks, fixing loose buttons, but always in the context of what those hands could do for her. This was different. Marco had noticed simply because I existed in his world, and he had wanted to add comfort to that existence. We worked in silence for a while, the wheel spinning, clay taking shape. The studio smelled faintly of earth and kiln heat. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Every so often I glanced at the gloves, now resting on the bench beside me, and felt that small pulse of gratitude. Halfway through the morning, Marco looked up from his pot. "My aunt used to say, 'Family is the people who keep you warm. Sometimes they're not the people you are born to.'" I met his eyes across the room. "She was right," I said. "Sometimes family starts where you least expect it." He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his work. I thought about that as I centered the next lump of clay. My own family tree had deep roots, but some of its branches had turned away from the light. And here was this young man, unrelated to me in any way that could be written down, offering warmth without condition. When we finished for the day, I wrapped the vase in plastic to keep it moist and pulled the gloves back on. The wool smelled faintly of the lavender soap Marco's aunt must have used to wash it. I stepped out into the crisp air, my fingers shielded from the bite of the wind, and felt, just for a moment, that I was walking home with something more than a pair of gloves. I was carrying proof that kindness doesn't need permission, and that sometimes the truest bonds are the ones you never saw coming. Late that evening, after the studio had cooled and the gloves Marco made were resting by the door, I opened my laptop. The inbox held a new message from Clara. The subject line was just my name. I clicked it, feeling the familiar tug in my chest, the old reflex that told me to read, answer, fix. She began with what she called clarification. The words were neat, measured, like she had written them in a hurry and then gone back to smooth the edges. She said there had been misunderstandings about the wedding arrangements, that the decision to keep it intimate was mostly Ethan's family's idea, that she thought I would understand the need to avoid tension. The second paragraph shifted. She said she felt hurt that I hadn't returned her calls, that my silence was making things more complicated than necessary, that I was taking things the wrong way. She hoped we could reset the tone if I would just respond. And then came the final turn, the one that made the first 2 paragraphs feel like a prelude. She wrote, "If you can send the remaining 45,000 euros, I'm sure we can work something out to include you in the guest list. It would mean rearranging the seating chart, but we could make it happen." She added a link to the caterer's balance. The numbers blinked like a metronome. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. The words didn't change. My place at my daughter's wedding had been reduced to a variable in a financial equation. I could have a seat if I paid for it. Without thinking, I reached for the chipped jasmine teacup on the table. It was half full, the tea cooled to the temperature where flavor turns flat. I set it down carefully, the chip facing me like a witness. My thumb found its familiar groove. The chip had been there for nearly 30 years. Clara was 6 the morning it happened. She had insisted on making tea for me because I had been working late the night before. I remember the way her small hands gripped the kettle, how I hovered behind her, ready to steady it. She poured too quickly. The cup tipped against the metal spout and a small crescent broke from the rim. Her eyes went wide, her mouth forming an O of panic. I laughed. I told her it was fine, that the cup still worked, that some things are even more precious when they carry a story. I drank the tea she made, too strong, too sweet, and kept the cup. It became part of my mornings, a reminder of care offered freely, without expectation. Now, decades later, I held that same cup and read my daughter's offer to sell me back into her celebration. The contrast was sharp enough to make the air feel thinner. Once she had poured for me because she loved me. Now she poured conditions into every invitation. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of the cup settle into my palm. Love is not a commodity to negotiate, I thought. Not this kind. Not mine. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the lake was a flat sheet of silver under the moon. My phone lay face down beside the laptop, the screen dark. I could have answered. I could have told her how the words felt like a transaction instead of an embrace. I could have reminded her of mornings when I carried her, feverish, through snow to the doctor, of years when my hands ached from work but still turned the pages of her bedtime stories. But some truths are not for convincing. They are for keeping, like the chip in the cup, as proof that once something was whole, and that even broken, it could still hold what mattered. I closed the laptop. The email would stay there, unread again. I lifted the cup and drank the last swallow, lukewarm and strong. The rim touched the same place on my lip it had touched for years, and I let it. I would not pay for my seat in her life. I had already paid in ways she would never calculate, in currency she no longer seemed to recognize. I set the cup down. The ceramic rang softly against the wood, a small clear sound in the stillness, like a bell marking the end of a service. I turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the doorway, watching the lake gather the night. Behind me, the laptop's black screen reflected my outline, a woman who would not barter love for a chair at a table she funded. Then I walked down the hall, the house quiet as a chapel, and let the dark be kind. The morning after, I closed the laptop and let the cup's faint ring fade. Henry knocked. 2 measured taps that never startled the birds in the hedge. I opened the door and found him with his cap in one hand and a paper sack balanced on his hip. Apples again, and that quiet look that means I will not ask until you are ready to speak. He followed me to the kitchen where winter light lay across the table like folded linen, where the kettle waits and the day decides what it will be. I warmed the water while he set his tools by the back door. When steam rose, we sat. I poured strong black tea and told him the essentials. A text that said, "Stay home." An email that offered me a seat if I wired the rest of the money. No anger, just nouns and verbs laid out like tools. He listened the way a carpenter listens for studs behind a wall, head tilted, ear searching for the hollow. When I finished, he turned his cup once in his hands and nodded, as if to say that truth had the right grain. "All right," he said. "Then I should tell you mine. 3 summers ago, I bought a navy suit I could not quite afford. My son, Peter, was marrying in Bristol. I tucked the train ticket into my wallet with the stiff edges of vows I had written, because I wanted to say one true thing and say it clean. Marlene had died the winter before. The house in Devon sat empty while we argued with silence about whether to sell. I wrote to Peter and offered to sell and split it fairly. He called me cold and said grief should not be tallied on paper. A month before the wedding, the bride's stepmother called. Her voice smiled for photographs. She said the ceremony would be intimate. The pictures needed to look clean. Blended families muddle the frame. For the sake of harmony, she said, the guest list during the vows would be purely the bride's side. Then she used the word awkward, as if vowels could be knives, and told me I could come to the reception later if I stood where the cameras would not find me. He paused and watched the steam thin. I wrote to Peter, he said. I told him I would stand at the back. No photos, no fuss. I only wanted to hear him promise. He emailed 2 lines. Dad, please do not come. It will be easier for everyone. Beneath it sat a link to a live stream. He lifted his cup, lowered it again. I returned the suit. I mailed the vows to an address he no longer used. On the day, he said, I walked to St. Martin's on the hill above the village. Not their church, just one with a bell. When distant bells began, I stood in the doorway and spoke the vows to the empty nave. They were not for them anymore. They were for me, for the boy I had carried when there was no one else to lift him. Afterward, I sat on the stone wall and watched swallows stitch the sky. No one called. The air felt honest. His fingers tapped the table, patient, measured. After the wedding, silence. A Christmas card forwarded once. No handwriting I knew. When Marlene's will finally closed, I sold the Devon place, sent Peter half, and kept my receipt. People said that would bring the sun back. It did not. Money makes poor mortar when the arch has already fallen. He looked at me without flinching. You understand, he said, and I nodded because I did. The room steadied around the quiet. I did not need him to explain how it felt. My own mirror stood in the same cold light. A chair traded for a transfer. A father traded for a clean frame. Somewhere, a florist ironed ribbon. Somewhere, a parent measured the distance between love and humiliation and chose not to cross it. You and I were asked to disappear for the sake of harmony, he said. Harmony does not require a disappearance, only a tuning. He let out a breath that sounded like the last note of a hymn. This is not only your story, Amelia. It is a fashion now, tidiness over truth. He pushed the sack of apples toward me, and the gesture felt like a benediction. Bake a pie, he said. Feed someone who has not asked you to earn your seat. We stood and carried our cups to the sink. The small porcelain clicked in the basin, ordinary as rain. We rinsed them in the choreography neighbors learn when they have shared enough winters. Outside, the lake drew silver threads between gusts of wind. In the window, our reflections lined up like kin, whether anyone invited us or not. 2 faces with edges softened by steam and time. They will say it was practical, I said. They will say we were difficult. He dried his hands on a rag and gave me the kind of smile that forgives nothing and pities no one. "They will," he answered. "Let them." I turned the chipped cup until the flaw found my lip and took a sip that tasted like resolve. I thought, not for the first time, how many kitchens hold this conversation? How many parents bless their children from a distance? How often we are told to be grateful for a link instead of a place. This is not a single wound, it is a pattern, and we were two small stitches deciding not to tear. I was halfway through hanging laundry on the balcony when I heard the distinct crunch of tires on the gravel path below. Visitors were rare here, especially without warning. I leaned over the railing, and there she was, Isabel, standing beside a small rental car, one hand waving, the other balancing a pie tin wrapped in a checkered cloth. "Aim!" she called up, her voice warm and unmistakable. "Surprise!" I didn't realize how quickly I was moving until I felt my slippers scuff against the stairs. She smelled faintly of cinnamon when I hugged her, the scent rising from the still warm pie between us. Her hair was shorter than I remembered, and there were more lines around her eyes, but the way she looked at me, steady, knowing, was unchanged. "I baked this at the villa I'm staying in," she said, lifting the pie like an offering. "Apple. Just like we used to make when we were 20. I laughed, a small, startled sound, and took it from her. The crust was golden, a little uneven at the edges. It looked perfect. We sat on the balcony for a while, the lake in front of us stretching like a mirror into the hazy afternoon. I made tea. She insisted on cutting generous slices of pie. The first bite was sweet, tangy, and so full of memory I had to pause before speaking. "I didn't know you were coming," I said finally. "That was the point," she replied. "You wouldn't have let me if I'd asked." We didn't need to speak of Clara. Isabel already knew enough. She could read the shadows under my eyes. After the second slice, she suggested we walk. The path along Lake Como was quiet, just the occasional motorboat hum in the distance. The water lapped gently against the stone edges, and the autumn leaves rustled above us. I could feel the sun loosening the chill in my shoulders. "You've made a life here," Isabel said, glancing at the row of terracotta-roofed houses we passed. "Do you ever get lonely?" "Loneliness and we've made a sort of truce," I answered. "It's not as sharp as it used to be, more like a shadow that follows you on sunny days, always there, but you learn to live with it." She nodded, kicking a pebble into the water. "I think about that a lot, what it means to grow older, alone, whether it's freedom or punishment." We walked in silence for a few steps. I could feel her words lingering, testing the edges of my own thoughts. "Maybe it's both," I said. "Freedom from the noise, punishment for not seeing the truth sooner." We stopped by a small wooden bench, the kind that leans slightly from years of use. Isabel sat first, patting the space beside her. From here, the lake seemed endless. A white sailboat moved slowly across, the wind barely enough to stir its course. "I didn't come here just to check on you," she said softly. "I came because I wanted to see you claim something for yourself. You've spent decades giving. Your time, your money, your heart. And for what? People who think your value ends where their convenience begins?" Her words hit in the quietest way, like a wave lapping but soaking deep into the sand. "I don't know if I know how to do that," I admitted. "You do," she insisted. "You just haven't given yourself permission. We deserve the rest of our lives. Not to wait for invitations that might never come, not to beg for space in someone else's story, to write our own." I looked at her, the lines around her mouth deepening as she smiled. Isabel had her own wounds, though she rarely spoke of them, the kind that made her voice stronger when she talked about starting over. We stayed there until the light shifted gold, the shadows stretching long over the water. When we stood to leave, she looped her arm through mine, the way we used to when we were younger and thought the world was ours for the taking. Maybe, I thought, it still could be. Not in the way we imagined, but in a way we could claim now. Deliberate, quiet, ours. Back at the house, I set the remaining pie in the kitchen. Isabel poured 2 small glasses of wine she had tucked into her bag. We clinked them together, not for the past or even for the future, but for this day, this bench, this lake, this choice. She smiled again and repeated like a gentle vow, "We deserve the rest of our lives, Amy." And for the first time in a long while, I felt the truth of it settle in me, steady and sure. The morning after Isabel's surprise visit, the studio felt warmer. Her words left an ember in the air. I set a lump of clay on the wheel and centered it with both palms, letting the hum steady my breath. Marco arrived a few minutes later, hair damp from mist, scarf looped twice around his neck. He waved, then hovered by the doorway, carrying a heavy question. "Come in," I said, nodding toward his bench. "Tea is on the shelf. Help yourself." He did not move to the kettle. He tugged a loose thread on his sleeve. "Signora Amelia, can I ask something not about clay?" I stopped the wheel and faced him. "Ask anything." He drew a breath that lifted his shoulders. "My mother's cousin wrote to me. She found me through someone from the old neighborhood. She said the family wants to see me, to talk about the past, to meet people I do not remember." He looked at the floor. "I have not seen them since I was 9. I gestured to the stool by my table, and he sat, perching on the edge like he might run. The studio was quiet except for the tick of the cooling kiln. I waited. "When my mother died," he said, "everything got shuffled. My father left. He had his problems. I went to my aunt. She was kind but sick sometimes. The cousins were older. They were busy. They said they would come, but they did not. The last time I heard from anyone blood-related, they asked if I could be useful at the restaurant. I was 13. He lifted his hands, palms up. Now they say they want to be family again. I do not know if that is a door I should open." The question settled between us. I thought of Clara's email in the chipped cup. I poured us tea and slid a mug toward him. "Do you want to go?" I asked. "Or do you feel told to go?" He considered. "I feel told, and I feel curious. Both are true." "They can be," I said. "Curiosity is honest. Obligation can be a mask." He blew on his tea. "If I go, am I betraying the people who were my family when the blood ones were not? If I do not go, am I closing a door forever?" I set my mug down and let the warmth linger in my hands. Let me say something I wish someone had said to me. Blood does not always equal love. It can. Sometimes it beautifully does, but the proof is care, not a shared name. Family is made by who shows up and stays. When someone reappears after years of absence, I said, you get to decide the terms. Meet in a public place. Bring a friend. Keep your address private. Leave early if your body says leave. You can also say no without defending it. He smiled. You speak like a person who learned this the hard way. I am still learning, I said. He reached into his bag and pulled out a folded letter. She wrote about Christmas. She said they saved a place at the table for me. I do not know if that is true or if the place is next to the sink. The image hit me. I saw a chair with no coat over it, a plate no one warmed, a boy earning his bite. A tremor moved through my chest. Ask her where the place is, I said. Listen to the space between words. If she says, we would love to see you however you feel comfortable, that is a road. If she says, we need you here because it will make us look right, that is a wall. He refolded the letter and slid it back. You think I should not go? I think you should not go to pass a test. I said, go only if the visit feeds you, not because it fills a photo. He looked at the shelves lined with drying bowls, at the gloves he knit for me, drying on a peg. "Sometimes I think this," he said, gesturing around, "is more family than any house I lived in." "Sometimes family begins where no one planned it," I said, "where someone notices your hands are cold and knits you warmth." He nodded, a quiet yes. The question had not disappeared. It had changed shape, become something he could lift without straining. He stood, rolled his sleeves, and moved to the wheel. The room resumed its music: spin, water, clay. I returned to my piece and felt with a steadiness that surprised me that telling him the truth had told it to me as well. Outside, the lake breathed. Inside, I finally did too. Quietly. Fully. It was Henry who found it. He knocked gently on my door late in the morning, holding a single postcard between two fingers as though it might crumble. "From your box," he said, eyes steady. I took it and saw the photograph, two intertwined gold rings printed over an image of a small restaurant terrace lit with string lights. The address on the back was the same as the place in town that hosted birthdays and anniversaries for locals. In looping handwriting, "We've decided on something more intimate, just close friends. Hope you're well. C." No salutation, no invitation. I turned it over again, studying the photograph. I could almost hear the clinking of glasses, the polite laughter, the sound of someone telling a toast that didn't belong to me. I imagined the chairs, 12, maybe 15, arranged in a half circle so everyone could see the bride. No room for me, even as the one who made the original wedding in Italy possible. Henry lingered, watching my face for the sharp break, the collapse he might have expected. But the truth was, there wasn't one. Not this time. I had already spent the grief months ago when the first message told me to stay home. What was left now was space. "Small weddings can be lovely," I said, setting the postcard on the table beside my teacup. The cup was half full and cooling. No pressure, just the people you choose. His brow furrowed. "You're not—" "I'm fine," I said. Then I realized it wasn't a performance. I was. For the first time in this whole tangled mess, I meant it. My chest didn't tighten. My throat didn't close. "Truly, Henry, I'm fine." He nodded slowly, still unconvinced but willing to let it rest. We sat for a while in the quiet, the postcard between us like a stone smoothed by water. I traced the edge with my finger. There was a time when this would have hollowed me out, when I would have begged for a seat, even at the very end of the table. But something had shifted. Maybe it was Isabel's voice reminding me I had a right to my own remaining years. Maybe it was Marco asking if family was worth finding again. Maybe it was Henry's own story, proof that exclusion wasn't personal as much as it was a pattern. I looked up and caught Henry watching me. "You know," I said, "there's a kind of freedom in knowing the door is closed for good. No more knocking, no more waiting for someone to open it. You can turn and walk towards something else." He smiled faintly. "Where will you walk, Amelia?" I thought of the studio, of clay under my nails, of the lake at dawn. I think I'm already there. When he left, I picked up the postcard again, not to read it, but to slide it into the back of the wooden box where I kept other endings. Not to dwell on, but to keep as a marker. Proof of the day I realized I was truly, finally all right. And as I closed the lid, I said it softly to the empty room. "I'm fine. This time I really am." The text came 3 days later, when the late afternoon sun was bleeding gold across the lake and my hands were deep in a coil of damp clay. My phone buzzed on the workbench. I wiped my fingers on my apron before picking it up. "Mom, I found your pottery apron while unpacking some boxes. I remembered the smell of the clay. Thought you'd like to know I read it twice." The words sat there, plain without punctuation except the single ellipsis she chose to put between memories. I imagined her holding that apron, probably still bearing a faint mark of a thumbprint or glaze from years ago. I could almost see her, small hands tugging at the fabric, giggling when she stood on a stool to reach the wheel. The memory was tender, but it didn't pull me under. It floated past, a ripple across the surface of a lake I had learned to keep calm. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I could have replied. Something polite, something warm, an opening. Instead, I set the phone down, face down this time, and turned back to the clay. The wheel spun, and the shape under my hands began to take form, a wide, rounded vessel with a lip soft enough to invite touch. The motion was grounding, a reminder that my present life was here, in this room, not inside the small space between Clara's words. Outside, the sun sank lower, scattering orange light across the water until it looked like liquid copper. The air smelled faintly of rain coming in from the mountains. I lifted the finished piece from the wheel, placed it gently on the shelf, and poured myself a cup of tea. The steam rose in a thin ribbon, catching the last light of the day. I sat with the cup warming my hands, letting the quiet settle in. Somewhere in town, a bell rang the hour. Somewhere else, Clara might have been slipping the apron back into its box, or hanging it somewhere she could see. I didn't know if the message was an olive branch or just a flicker of nostalgia she would forget by morning, but I knew that my answer, or my silence, would shape me more than her intention. And in that moment, silence felt whole. I sipped the tea, the warmth moving through me in small waves. The clay on my hands had dried into fine lines, like a map of everything I'd touched that day. I looked out at the lake, the horizon slowly folding into night, and felt the truth without needing to speak it. I was not waiting anymore. The phone stayed on the bench. The light faded. And I, Amelia Hartman, sat in my studio with a heart that was no longer asking to be chosen. I had chosen myself. Morning wore a pale sheen over Lake Como. The water looked brushed with silver. I was grinding beans when two careful knocks tapped the door. Henry stood there with a burlap sack of apples balanced against his hip. Red and gold skins glowed as if they had trapped the sunrise. He toed off his boots at the mat and passed the sack to me, leaving the scent of orchard leaves and cold air in the doorway. "Your pie pan is still in my kitchen," I said, smiling. "You will have to collect rent if I keep it any longer." "Keep it," he answered, the corner of his mouth tilting. "Consider it a long lease, paid in slices." He set a folded note on the table, a list of fence posts he planned to replace before the rains, a sketch, small and neat, of the corner that leans. We shared tea. He tested one apple with his thumb like a jeweler weighing a stone. He did not ask about Clara. I did not bring her into the room. The space between us stayed easy, warmed by steam and the ordinary holiness of two cups. When Henry left, the gate clicked, and I heard Marco's bike bell from the lane. He coasted by with a paper bag of bread in his basket. The gray gloves he knit for me peeked from his pocket. He lifted a hand high. "Buongiorno, Signora Amelia," he called. His smile carried across the hedges. I waved back with the apple knife still in my hand. Sunlight flashed along the blade. A bird rose like a comma into the sky. The studio clock chimed 9. I washed my hands, tied my apron, and wrote a list in thick pencil on the pad by the sink. Glaze test, kiln sweep, 3 mugs to trim, phone the ferry office about schedules. The old life had been arranged around other people's urgencies. This life ticked with a rhythm that fit my breathing. The wheel hummed when I pressed the pedal. Clay centered under my palms. A cylinder lifted like a tide accepting the moon. Mid-morning brought a message tone from the phone resting near the window. I wiped slip from my fingers and checked the screen. Isabel's name filled the top line. Below it, a photo burst open. 2 train tickets to Paris tucked beside a map with a red circle around the Marais. Her text followed. "Flights are extortionate this week. Trains are kinder. I booked 2 seats. No arguments. The gallery preview is Thursday. Come see what we once promised ourselves." A second bubble arrived with a smiling face. I set the phone down and leaned against the sill. The lake glittered as if it had overheard. My calendar lay open on the counter, pencil squares already filled with small, sturdy tasks. Henry's fence, Marco's glaze trial, a kiln firing on Wednesday, tea with Lena from the market on Friday. I held the pencil above the page and understood the shape of what I was seeing. My days were not empty. They were spoken for by a life I had planted quietly and tended in weather both kind and cruel. I texted Isabel a photo of the apples on the table, then typed, "I am tempted. I am also scheduled to be alive here." She replied in less than a minute, "Being alive travels. Bring the chip-lipped cup if it fits." I laughed. The sound bounced off the tile and stayed. I did not pack the cup. I did place a hand on its rim and thank it for years of mornings. Then I returned to the wheel. Clay cooled my hands. A handle grew from a rolled coil. I joined it to a mug with a slip that looked like cream. The kiln door shut with a solid iron kiss. Heat began its slow rise. Numbers climbed on the dial with patience. Near noon, I sliced an apple and ate it over the sink. Juice ran along my wrist. I licked it, shameless and content. Outside, the ferry hooted, low. I realized there was no room left where regret could anchor. The hours were full, the house enough, the heart busy. Whatever I had not been invited to no longer dictated the table where I sat. Henry's list waited for a nail on the wall. Marco's bread sat warming in a cloth. Isabel's tickets waited in my messages like a door held open. I washed the knife. I dried my hands. I looked around the kitchen as if I might catch it speaking. It did. In bowls and tools and cooling clay, in apples and steam and light, it said, "Live here. Now. Fully." I answered out loud, "I will." 2 days after Isabel's visit, the sky over Como opened into a clear blue that felt like permission. I woke before the ferries sounded, brewed jasmine in the chipped cup, pressed my thumb to the flaw, and listened to the house breathe. The tickets waited in my messages, a soft insistence, a hand at my back. I said the words to the window first, testing how they lived in the air. "I am going to Paris." The sentence did not wobble. It found a place to stand in my chest. I pulled my small canvas suitcase with scuffed corners from the wardrobe. I folded 2 dresses, a sweater, the gray gloves Marco made. Into a side pocket, I tucked a notebook, a pencil, and a ticket stub from a winter concert I attended alone, proof that music still belongs to me. Before I zipped the case, I laid the wooden box on the bed. I did not open it. I rested my palm on the lid and blessed the girl who saved for a balcony seat and never claimed it. Then I slipped a small envelope under the ribbon that keeps my passport closed. Inside it, a note for myself. "You are not traveling to be useful. You are traveling to be alive." At the door, I left a message for Henry with a copy of my key, asking him to bring in the mail and to eat whatever ripens in the bowl. I texted Marco the kiln schedule and a sketch for the handles he wanted to try. His reply arrived with a line that made me laugh. "Bring me a story and a crumb of Paris bread." By noon, I was on the train, facing a window where the lake unspooled like a silver ribbon. The carriage smelled of coffee and wool. Travelers arranged themselves into small temporary families. I took out the notebook and wrote one line, leaving for myself, arriving for myself, returning to myself. The rhythm of the rails agreed. As the miles gathered, another memory lifted. 20 years earlier, I took a night bus to Paris with a different purpose. I needed extra wages before Christmas. Overtime at the bakery would not cover Clara's coat and January rent. A cousin of a friend knew a hotel near Montparnasse that needed holiday help. I packed one bag and promised Clara I would be back before the school concert. That Paris was not museums and light. It was back doors and service halls, trays heavier than pride, the ache of feet learning new blisters. I rose before dawn to polish glass and set tables. I learned the language of yes and now and right away. Between lunch and dinner, I walked beneath iron balconies and counted tips under a scarf, then bought postcards I never mailed because stamps felt like a luxury. On my last night, a violinist played outside the metro. We stood listening for 3 songs, then went back to shift change with red hands and quiet hearts. I smiled at the thought. Survival had been my art there, endurance my craft then. The train slid past fields and villages, setting tables for evening. I touched the edge of the chipped cup wrapped in a towel inside my bag. I had brought it after all, a small traveling altar to mornings that shaped me. Isabel's message pinged when we crossed the border. Room is ready, dinner at a place with blue chairs. Dress how you feel most yourself. At Gare de Lyon, the station lifted around me like a cathedral of iron and glass. I stepped onto the platform and felt a clean thread of joy run through my spine. Isabel waved from the far end, her scarf a bright stripe against the crowd. We hugged with the relief of women who have carried more than they listed. On the taxi ride to the Marais, the city's edges stitched themselves familiar and new. Boulangeries with smudged windows, a florist lifting buckets, a girl on a scooter singing to traffic. Isabel pointed out the gallery, a white rectangle of promise on a narrow street. "Tomorrow," she said, tapping my knee. "Tonight we eat, for pleasure, not fuel." Our room was small and kind, 2 beds, a window that made a painting of the roofs. I set the cup on the sill and the gloves beside it, then washed my hands and watched the day turn honey over zinc and stone. Somewhere behind us, the lake moved through its evening. Somewhere ahead, a quartet would tune for a preview I had not yet seen. This was not the Paris of service hallways and aching arches. This time, I arrived with nothing to prove and everything to feel. The rain in Paris had a way of making the pavements shine like polished stone, as if the city dressed up for you without asking who you were. Isabel and I spent the morning wandering the Rue de Rivoli, dipping into bookshops and cafes, letting the hours loosen their grip. After lunch, she excused herself to visit a gallery 2 streets over, urging me to take time for something just mine. I walked without direction until I found myself in front of a small, elegant theater. The posters in the window glowed under soft lights. One in particular caught me, an evening concert by the same symphony whose performance I had once saved for and never seen. The name of the conductor was different now, and so were many of the players. But the music listed was the same program I had dreamed of all those years ago in New York. I stood there, rain sliding from my hair onto my collar, feeling my heartbeat in my palms. The box office was inside a glass door, the warmth spilling out when someone exited. I stepped in before I could talk myself out of it. The woman at the counter greeted me in French, and I asked, softly but surely, for 1 ticket. Best available. She slid the small envelope across the counter. The paper was crisp, the ink still smelling faintly of the press. As I held it, my chest filled with something both weightless and steady, like closure but gentler, like a circle drawn not to trap something inside, but to protect it. Walking back into the street, I slipped the ticket into the same pocket where the old, unused one still rested inside the wooden box back in Como. I imagined them side by side, a before and an after. One a symbol of what I gave away, the other of what I chose to give myself. I didn't rush to share the news with Isabel. This was a gift I wanted to unwrap in my own time. That evening, I dressed in the navy dress I had packed almost on a dare to myself. The gloves Marco knitted stayed in my bag, my fingers wanting the feel of the cool ticket between them. When the lights dimmed in the theater, the opening notes swelled and filled the air. I closed my eyes. I could see the girl I had been waiting for a night like this, never knowing she would miss it. I sent her a silent message. We made it. Not on time, not the way we planned, but we made it. When the last note faded, the applause felt like it belonged to all the years in between. I walked back through streets slick with rain, the ticket warm from my hand. It was not just paper. It was proof that some dreams wait patiently, changing shape until you're ready to meet them without debt, without guilt. Returning to Como felt different this time. The lake greeted me with its usual glassy calm, but my steps from the station to my front door carried a new steadiness. The chipped cup waited on the kitchen shelf, right where I had left it. I boiled water, poured the tea, and settled into the chair by the window. Outside, Henry was at his fence, waving without words. Marco passed on his bicycle, calling a greeting in Italian that made me smile. My calendar lay open, full as ever, but today I let the hours stretch. I reached for the wooden box and opened it. The old ticket lay inside, still a little yellowed at the edges. I set it beside my new one on the table. The sight of them together felt like a conversation between past and present, a question asked long ago, answered at last. I thought of Clara, not with the ache that used to follow her name, but with a quiet acceptance. I had not been at her wedding. I had paid for it and been told to stay home, and I had stayed home in the way that mattered most. I stayed in my own dignity. If my presence could be negotiated away, then so could my effort. That truth, once bitter, now felt clean. Steam curled from the cup, and I lifted it slowly, letting the warmth anchor me. The crack along the rim caught the light. A flaw, yes, but one that told a story about care, about keeping something even when it's imperfect, maybe especially then. As the sun began to set, the lake turned gold, and the air smelled faintly of rain from somewhere up the valley. I leaned back, feeling the weight of my own company, and finding it enough. I thought of all the women and men, too, who have given until they were emptied, only to discover that some people will still ask for more. I wanted to tell them, you can stop. You can put the cup down. You can keep what's left for yourself and call it love. I looked straight ahead as if to an unseen listener. What do you think? Was I wrong? I asked, my voice low but certain. If you've ever been through something like this, leave a comment. Tell me how you found your way back. The last light folded over the water. I took the final sip of tea, set the cup down, and let the silence settle. Not as an absence, but as a presence I could finally trust. The light over Lake Como had a way of turning silver in the late afternoon, as though the day itself was folding its edges before closing. I sat by the open window, my hands resting on the sill, the chipped porcelain cup now empty beside me. Outside, the water moved in slow breaths, each ripple catching the fading sun. If there were a camera in this faceless telling, it would be pulling back now, wide enough to hold the curve of the lake, the quiet line of mountains beyond, and me in this small corner framed by lace curtains and soft shadows. My hair caught the breeze, strands lifting, settling again. I let out a long breath, not from sorrow, not from regret, but from a release that felt both quiet and complete. For so long, my story had been about showing up for others, even when I had to disappear from myself. Now, for the first time in years, I had chosen me. And this time, I would not apologize. The world beyond my window seemed to agree. The swans along the shore drifted without urgency. The soft hum of a boat motor carried over the water, far enough away to feel like background music. I could smell fresh bread from somewhere down the street, mingling with the faint scent of lavender from the garden below. I thought of the people who might be hearing this story, faces I would never see, lives I would never fully know, but hearts that might beat in recognition. So before we say goodbye, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee resting near your hand? Or a late night where stories like this keep you company long after the world has gone to sleep? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, I hope you'll consider subscribing. Not just to hear more stories like this, but to become part of a community that still believes in kindness, in healing, in second chances. because they still exist, even when the world tries to convince you otherwise. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you. I hope you remember that sometimes the miracle doesn't knock loudly at your door. It waits quietly, patiently, until you are ready to open your heart to it. The wind shifted, cool from the lake, and I reached for the cup again, letting my fingers trace the familiar chip along its rim. A flaw, but one that did not diminish its worth, just like the lives we live, just like the people we become. As the last of the sunlight softened into twilight, I leaned back in my chair, the view wide and open before me. My chest rose and fell in an easy rhythm. I was not waiting for anyone to arrive or for anyone to call. I was here, in my own company, and it was enough. Take care, my friend. We'll meet again in the next story. Until then, remember, I chose myself, and this time, I am not sorry.